right, it looks like we are recording and we are live.
And we have minutes too, so that's good. And Jose. All right, we are all here. Maybe Jose, oh, looks like you're in. Are you in, Jose? Yeah, he's nodding. Okay, we'll do our agenda and materials review before we do anything else. We got our agenda emailed to us. Is there anything that we'd like to change about the agenda or talk about the materials? I noticed that there's no break. We should be done in 2 hours, so I think we can make it for 2 hours without a break. Is that agreeable? Okay, I see nodding, thumbs up. All right. Public comment. I always hate doing this before the time it's scheduled. Can we approve minutes from May before? Can we change that? Can we move that up before public comment? So public comment, okay. Are there any, so then we are changing the agenda to have number 4 come after number 1. Are there any, oh, do we need to move? Okay, it's moved. Do we have any adjustments to the minutes that were in the agenda packet?
I move that we accept the minutes as submitted.
I'll second.
All right, the minutes are approved. And that didn't take very much time.
Carolyn, I have to do a little spiel before public comment, so we might, I guess we want people to hear it, but we could do comments from board members. I mean, it's up to you.
Sure. Yeah, we can do that. So I have an order. I'll put it in the chat for everybody. All panelists. So we're going to start with Lindsay, then Bill, Jose, Rick, Michael, oops, Bernadette, and then I will end it. So Lindsay, do you have any comments?
Just general comments. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. I think, and I didn't make like a prepared statement, just that this was a really difficult and terrible case. And so I feel pretty humbled even just having witnessed it. So thank you all for being here tonight to watch this process.
So I guess the only thing I'll say is say thank you to everybody for coming tonight. Anytime a life is lost and that we have to look at it is a really tough event for everybody involved in this case and everybody that had to work on it. And I appreciate everybody's hard work and trying to figure this out and looking at this case in depth. You know, it's an important role that we play, especially in these ones, that we take an honest and fair look at how the investigation went and the outcome that was determined, if we agree or not agree with it. But I think it's a great responsibility for us to have to look at something after somebody's lost their life. That's it.
Jose. Jose, you're up next.
Yeah, sorry. I also don't have a prepared statement. When things like when immediate and extraordinary things happen, you don't really call somebody like me more of a philosopher type to educate on decisions like this. I'm used to trying to bring complexity into situations, and for me the complexity is already here, and I'm still trying to think about how to like refer to and speak of the dead. I don't mean to be melodramatic about it, but Yeah, that's how I come to read this case.
Thank you, Jose and Bill. And Lindsay, I agree with Bill and Jose both. I think that it's a very devastating thing. And I think it sure sobered me up when I started looking at the photos and started reading the reports. And there's the responsibility involved is heightened, and it brings to mind the need for officers to be looked at with respect, because these are the types of decisions that they have to be made, they have to make every day, potentially. And it's those of us who go to work in the morning don't have that responsibility. And so I think that it's a hard one for us to come in late and look at, but it's something that I guess we owe the community to do. So that's what we're here for.
Thank you everyone for being here tonight. You know, I kind of pride myself on being sort of tough emotionally, and I teach about difficult subjects and expect my students to discuss them rationally and all this. And I found myself when I started watching the body cam footage a little unprepared for the way and it wasn't, you know, there was the sort of key body worn video that I watched first, and you know what I was expecting there, but I then started watching some of the officers who first responded, and there was one where I thought, okay, this is good. He's got this camera has a good like viewpoint of the scene. I'm going to get a lot of information from this. And then there was a point where the officer whose video I was wearing switched in to take over chest compressions. And what I wasn't prepared for was the sound. Yeah, and you know, the officer was in more or less the same position I was in when I held my father's hand while he died, and it was just very, very difficult. I lost it. I started weeping, and it gave me a lot of, as Rick said, it sobered me. It really gave me a different sense of not that I didn't have a sense of gravity of approaching the case, but so yeah, it was difficult.
So mine's comment's gonna be a little different. I'm wondering if we can't just permanently change the agenda items to never have public comment as number 2, that we can start with the minutes approval and comments from the board, or vice versa, and then get to public comment as number 4. I just think it would work better in the future, because we seem like we're there each month doing this. Jose, I appreciate your comment about that you like to bring complexity into the situation. And I think at the opposite end, I'm always seeing the complexity, and I'm trying to find the place to bring the reason and the sides together. It's like to teach each side. It's like something that they can take away from it, that what can the police take away from our review of something, and how do we express that to the community to be able to take away from something like this. And it's really hard when we have the public records laws in Oregon that we have that are so constrictive of what we can say and do and share. And I think it's frustrating. It's really hard to be able to have the open, honest conversation about these things when there are so many things that we have to be careful to not say. And so something like this, it's like I start, I try to stay emotionally disconnected from it, which is super hard in a case like this. But in order for me to be able to see how we as a community can move forward from this event, I have to kind of to do that, to be able to stay back. And I don't know that sometimes when I make comments this evening, it might come across as somewhat harsh, and I don't intend that to be, but I just recognize the need to see how we can go forward and not have a tragedy like this happen again. And so I'm hoping that as we have these conversations tonight, we can all kind of stop and think about, you know, what were the moments in time that someone could have done something different and had a better outcome. And I mean, I think it's upon all of us as a community to look for those moments and figure out a way that we can eventually get to the point where we're not having to review a case like this here in Eugene or any place. That's all.
I appreciate all of what everyone has said, and I'm not surprised that everybody came to this with a level of gravity that you are, because you are a wonderful group of people. So I'm glad to be having this conversation with you all. I think that this case, more than maybe any other case that I've ever looked at, really brought to focus our actual job as CRB members, because I think sometimes we talk a lot about what the officer did wrong or did right, or what they did or what they didn't do. And we don't necessarily get into much about the investigation process. And I think that this is kind of just in our faces. We need to talk about the investigation process. And that's essentially our job. We're there to watch. We're watching the watchers, right? We're making sure that the IA team and that Mark in his office at this time, we're doing their jobs. And I think that's really going to come up a lot tonight. So I want to make sure that everybody's thinking that way too. Do we have comments from the commission liaisons? Have there been meetings since our last meeting? I think that's now Michael and Jose.
Yes.
Can
You go first, because I have to find my notes.
I was just gonna pose a question and say that I did not attend a meeting this month. With a case like this, are we gonna get Leah one of your lovely recaps? Okay.
Yes. I wouldn't say lovely, but yes.
I would. Thank you.
Okay, so the police commission had its biennial, I guess, work plan retreat, where we discussed and then voted on the topics that we would like to address for over the next couple of years. It's a plan that I guess automatically has flexibility built into it, because obviously anything that the chief would like or that city council would like us to discuss gets sort of forwarded. And so it was like a 5-hour meeting on Zoom, and done knowing that that it was possibly all going to be displaced by the ad hoc committee's report and city council's recommendations based on that. So it may or may not have been a useless retreat, but it was kind of, I guess, nice to get to know the other commissioners a little bit better. What we came up with as our agenda, I am not finding it looks like it hasn't been emailed back to us yet. So I do know what it was, but I didn't take notes on it. And so it'll probably, and I think it gets presented to city council if it hasn't already. Leah, I'm looking at Leah. Do you know this? I think it gets presented to city council. It might have already happened or it might be happening this month.
I think it'll be June 28th, the same night that we are there.
So it gets presented to city council. So Maybe I shouldn't say what that work plan is anyway, right now. So, but you'll all know what it is when city council does, if not before. And that was in lieu of our regular meeting in May.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks both of you for doing that work. Next we can do public comment. Leah, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. So if we have any members from the public who want to offer public comment, please raise your hand. We don't have anyone attending over the phone, so I won't go through the whole *6 instruction set. There is a CRB protocol that requires that prohibits comment on the case being reviewed at the meeting where it is being reviewed. So I would discourage anyone from commenting on this particular case. I am not seeing anyone raise their hands, but I would like to offer, especially now that these meetings are being recorded and play, and then people can watch them whenever they wish, that if anyone would like to offer public comment, even on this case, they can write it and submit it to our office. It's policeauditor@eugene-or.gov. And I will distribute those to the CRB and they will be entered into the minutes of the next meeting. So I know it can be difficult to ask people to come back to comment on, especially cases like this that are, there's a lot of emotional heaviness there. So if people want to submit comments in writing, they are more than welcome to do that. I am not seeing anyone raise their hand, so I think that, Carolyn, we can move on from public comment.
All right, well then I'm going to turn it back over to you, Leah, for the case.
Sure, thanks for that. All right, hold on. I will get this queued up. But first, I do want to just say that I very much appreciate you all looking at these. I think often about the very first deadly force review that I did, and it was shocking, and it was not my life before before this job. Thank you, Mark, for bringing me here. But it's a very difficult thing to do, and it's a difficult thing to bring into your life. And I encourage you all to talk about it with each other, because I think it is a lot to process. So if you ever want to talk to me, you may. And I will just point, like, this is one of the reasons why Mark and I split them up, because they're a heavy load to carry. So that being said, I will share my screen to the slideshow and not anything else that's open. Oh, we've started in the middle. All right. There we go. Thank you all for your patience on that. So I did it because this is a little different than normal. I did it just a little introductory slide. So just a reminder that Oregon public records law prohibits the release of public safety employee personal information. So in this presentation, I refer to Officer A, Officer B, Officer C. I do refer to the involved person by their name because I think that that is respectful. And in my opinion, that's where I land. I'm happy to talk about that more with any of you, but you will see Mr. Rodriguez's name in here. So EPD senior staff, Captain Adams is here. I'm very appreciative of that. They are here to listen. The chief was going to be here and the deputy chief was going to be here, but they both had insurmountable issues pop up. So I'm very grateful that Captain Adams is here, but I do want to just point out that for questions on this case, questions about the investigation should go to Jason. Questions about the auditor's process should go to Mark. And questions about to EPD senior staff may be difficult for them to answer because there is ongoing litigation in this case. So you're more than welcome to ask those, but they may not be able to speak as freely as they would like because of the litigation. So, and then I think all of you know this, but I know it's also the first deadly force review for some of you. So especially for people who are watching, I wanted to do a brief overview of how these uses of deadly force by EPD are looked at. So the auditor's office is notified of critical incidents, including officer-involved shootings, uses of deadly force, and that's in the city ordinance, and that occurred in this case. The Interagency Deadly Force Investigations Team is IDFIT. They have jurisdiction over the criminal investigation of a use of deadly force, and they are notified as well. That team operates under a county plan that was enacted pursuant to state law. And then their investigation is, when it's complete, is given to the Lane County District Attorney, who makes a determination as to whether the deadly force was justified based on that investigation. When the district attorney has made their determination, then the IDFIT investigation gets provided to EPD, and Internal Affairs takes over any administrative investigation. And then that investigation is presented to an EPD use of force board. The auditor participates in the board, and that again is a requirement in city ordinance, but we are never a voting member. And that, I believe, was bargained for. So it's an opportunity for discussion. Case review. And I'm gonna, yeah, it's a tough one. So I did my best to get the salient points in here. But on November 30th, 2019, Officer A was on patrol and observed a person who was walking in the road in a residential area. Officer A contacted that person, who was later identified as Elaborio Rodriguez for the pedestrian violation. Officer A was wearing a body camera, which was activated just before that contact began. Officer A talked to Mr. Rodriguez about the pedestrian violation and then asked if they had identification. Mr. Rodriguez did not immediately respond. Officer A radioed for code 1, which is non-emergency cover. Things escalated quickly from there. So Officer A reached out and grabbed Mr. Rodriguez's arm. Mr. Rodriguez objected, started asking for a supervisor. Officer A changed their request for code 3, which is emergency cover. And it escalated from there. So Officer A stated Mr. Rodriguez was under arrest. They continued to ask for a supervisor. It turned into more of a physical resistance and then more of a physical dispute. Officer A deployed pepper spray. During this, Officer A's body camera was dislodged and the recording ended. And then they radioed that they were fighting with 1. Mr. Rodriguez was able to get away from A. There was a foot pursuit. The radio hand microphone came off also. Ultimately, they caught up to each other and the fight continued. And of course, then there is not video of this part. Mr. Rodriguez was got on top of Officer A and they were fighting. Officer A deployed a taser. That did not affect Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez then took control of the taser and deployed it on Officer A. They continued to fight, and then Officer A made the choice to use deadly force, grabbed their, sort of wriggled out from underneath and got their gun and fired at Mr. Rodriguez 3 times. Officer A then used the radio without the hand microphone to report the shots were fired. Officer B and Officer C arrived very quickly after that and worked to get Mr. Rodriguez into handcuffs and then provided first aid and CPR. And medics arrived and then pronounced Mr. Rodriguez deceased at 12 a.m. The IDFIT team was notified and responded to the scene, and the police auditor was also notified and went to the scene. The district attorney issued her findings December 13th. A use of force board was convened on March 5th. And the auditor was a non-voting member of that board. The board found that Officer A's actions before and during the use of force were within policy, and the employee's actions following the use of deadly force were within policy. The memo was dated March 6th, and then it went through the chain of command. Mark Gissner, the auditor, our office issued a separate set of recommendations, and that memo was dated September 14th. And then Chief Skinner's final adjudication, which concurred with the findings of the use of force board, was signed April 15th. So these are the relevant policies. You'll see this kind of starts to get different than my typical slideshows because how it all worked out was different than your usual case because it is an IDFIT case and not a typical IA investigation. So the use of force board recommended that the actions were within policy. And Mark, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I was trying to summarize as best I could. So recommended that Officer A violated certain policies at certain times of the incident, but also that the actual use of deadly force at the time that that was used was within policy. And then the chief concurred with the findings of the use of force board. So because it's not your typical investigation and not your typical case review, those top three are the categories that you guys usually look at: intake, classification, monitoring, all that stuff. And thinking about this and then speaking with Carolyn and just, I don't even remember all the people I've talked to about this case, and thinking about where we are with the ad hoc committee and police commission, it seems to me that this is a really timely opportunity for community input into use of force policies, force investigations policies. So, and looking at how CRB can make those recommendations to police commission with this in mind. So I kind of talked to Carolyn about talking about comments around investigations, around adjudications, and around policy recommendations. But that said, you guys had your typical sheets. So I don't want to direct your conversation too much, but that's just where I was thinking. And I think that's my last slide. So I will stop sharing and let you all go.
All right, so with that last slide, kind of the differences between the IDFIT and a normal investigation, I think that it would be helpful if we go around and talk about the investigation, and then we go around again and talk about adjudication, and then we go around again and talk about policy. Is everyone okay with that instead of our normal 3 topics that we cover? And you could fit all those things into these topics also. So I think Lindsay, you started with the comment. So Bill, you can go ahead and start talking about the investigation.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. So I guess I'm trying to figure out where to start in this process. And I guess I will start I'm not a big fan of the IDFIT process. And I haven't been for a number of years. We looked at it when I was on the police commission, but again, it's not within the EPD's jurisdiction to determine how that goes. I think that's actually set up by a state statute on how that, and the DAs are responsible for the ultimate. So I'll start there that I'm not fond of that. I think any investigation into deadly force by a police officer needs to be done by an outside agency, but I'm not sure that gathering a group of detectives with not sure of their experience or their abilities, I struggle with. And my example is in the interview of Officer A, is that they seem to stumble through this interview. They don't really understand it. They made comments. They're even corrected by Officer A's attorney a couple times during it. And this is where we're supposed to rely that they're doing a truly fair and impartial review of this. And it's not even, they don't even seem to understand why they're doing it or what they're doing, and they fumble through this very important piece, especially without video, that it really relies on what Officer A is saying and then verifying that through investigative work. And it just really left me with a lot of issues in reading through some of the reports and doing that. I just didn't have a lot of confidence in this. And, you know, I think that we need to look at this because the thing that comes to my mind is that for years and years, one of the things as we talk about police reforms is that they talk about the narrative. Who's in charge of the narrative when these incidents happen? And so we really got to be careful that we are making sure the narrative is a truly fair and impartial narrative and not just the narrative of what this group wants it to be. So, and from there, I'll then talk about a little bit about the board, and I may be jumping around and I'm just trying to figure out how to best talk about this. But the use of force board, you know, when I looked at this in this process, you know, I think there should be voting members that are not part of the department. I think the auditor should be one that should be able to weigh in on this, and talk and be able to do that during that process. I also think the auditor needs to make sure they speak up during this process and make sure it's then in the board's memos of their concerns and their issues with this. I think that's a responsibility of our auditor to do that. And I get back to the narrative again, that, you know, when I read some of these comments in here by the board, and here we have training officers in this, you know, when I looked at this incident, you know, and I don't want to be that armchair quarterback and tell them that Officer A, he should have done this, he should have done this, because I think sometimes that doesn't always mean that the outcome will be different, because we don't know the person they're dealing with, and we're looking at this later in time where we can stop and look at stuff. But just some of their comments in here that the officer should have been more assertive sooner, where I may believe that he should have been maybe less assertive, maybe waiting for backup, maybe waiting for some of those other things. But I think some of those things need to be talked about in this use of force board. You know, is there alternatives? Is there things to do that? And so I think that is a little miss. And I think by not having people outside of sworn officers that are voting members on it, I think could make a difference with that. And I think I'll stop there and let the next person talk.
I think it's me. And it doesn't feel appropriate for me at least to drone on in these situations, a situation like this one. So I'm gonna, go ahead, Mark.
No, I don't know how the hand thing works. I don't mind waiting for everybody to weigh in. I think that some of the things that were stated in the chief's memo are misguided, and I'll wait till everybody else speaks about that first, because I don't think that narrative is an entirely accurate depiction of how these issues were looked at. So I'll wait for everybody else first, because I'm curious to hear what the rest of you are saying. And my legs are cramping.
I think it's appropriate to keep my own comments brief. My first one is to say thank you to Bill for that suggestion. I think it's a suggestion that is in the best interest of the people of Eugene. I appreciate that. My comment when I read through a lot of the investigative material was that there's so much I don't understand. Not like jargon wise, but I just want to, in the interview with Officer A on page 12, there's a moment when one of the officers, am I allowed to read what they say? Okay, one of the officers
No names. That's
asks, okay, one of the officer asks, who made these questions? And then a union responds OSP. And it seems to be like there's some confusion here. That characterizes some other questions that I have. So yeah, I think that's an appropriate way to think about, what this communicates to the people of Eugene.
I think with respect to investigation, I'll say one thing, and that is that I don't think IDFIT is structured very well, in that there's no captain of the ship. When you have a number of different agencies involved, and they're all pointing to one another for assistance, the effectiveness is lost, I believe. And it seems to me that there ought to be one individual who's in charge of the investigation. But that's a matter for the state legislature, and I'm not going to get into that right now. But it just struck me that it was a weak investigation because it was scattered.
I think I'm next. And I apologize, I will probably not be brief. So we're doing investigation, adjudication, recommendations, correct? So I will do my best to be organized because I tend not to be. So for an investigation, as I see it, although we have primary documents related to IDFIT, and then the chief summary of the use of force board, and then the auditor's report, there's IDFIT, there's the DA, there's the use of force board, there's the chief, there's the auditor, right? So I'm going to break this into 5 sections. And a lot has been said about IDFIT, so I won't say much about that, except that since we are a public board, as a public meeting, I will say that I think that there's a place for all of us and for others who may be listening to this to write to our representatives in the state legislature to advocate for any changes that we think should be made. If as is the case, the statutes that created or the ordinances that created the auditor's office kind of happened at the simultaneous with this Senate Bill 111. Thank you, Sean, or Officer Adams. Then there was probably not coordination between those two things, and that would be a good thing to make our representatives aware of and our senators, that perhaps there should be amended into that law a place for police auditors and civilian boards where they exist to have a role in that process. So that doesn't seem like it'd be a difficult kind of amendment for the legislature to make. As far as I approached this file. I tried to be more systematic than I normally am. So I watched the body cam video, and then I read from beginning to end. I did not reorganize the file this time. I read from beginning to end, and I found myself disturbed for lots of different reasons with just because it was disturbing subject matter for the videos. And then as I read the file, I began to accept the narrative that was being repeated in the interview with Officer A, in the various accounts from EPD and from the district attorney's office. It started to have the repetition of a particular narrative started to sound correct until I read the auditor's report. And then I was reminded that what I had seen was something different. And so in education, we have a phrase, throwing off the curve. I feel like the auditor's report here really does that, insofar as it's much more rigorous than anything else in the file. And it sort of leaves me wondering, the number of points where the DA and the chief's memo recounting the use of force boards discussion deliberations are either describing something different than what is objectively on the video, or either people are seeing something different than what I see and what the auditor clearly saw, or there is an unintentional or intentional effort at obfuscation or misrepresentation. And I'm not going to say what it is because I don't know. I know that both of those things can happen, right? We repeat narratives that we've heard, and we often describe things in ways that are shaped by our preconceptions, our previous training, our life experiences, right? There are all kinds of reasons why objective accounts of objective events don't match up. I find it convincing that when the auditors describes the DA's report in places as being incorrect. This is page 9 of the auditor's report. The narrative of the DA's report reads, officer contacted Mr. Rodriguez, who would not provide identification or stop to converse, but grabbed some recycling from someone's bin at the curbside and put it in the trash bag he was carrying. And it's back to the audit. In fact, auditor's office review of the BWV shows that there was a conversation as detailed above. It was quite a lengthy conversation. There are other points where the DA's report seems to me and others to be inaccurate. There are also points where I have to say I was, when I reached the end of the IDFIT report, I was ready to accept this as a tragic situation and unfortunate. And then I started to read the chief's discussion of the use of force board, and I started to find myself upset, angry. And it started at when I realized that the board's discussion of de-escalation focused on whether or not de-escalation should be used less as a result of this case. And then it intensified when I read a description of the officer could not have known the homicidal intent that Rodriguez possessed. And this is repeated later. He's described as having an intent to kill. And there was nothing in the file that established to me that there was an intent to kill. I think the officer, I think, had a reasonable fear that he would be killed. That's different than establishing that someone has an intent to kill. And I think that the decision to describe it that way, some of the decisions made in the DA's report, the decision to spend, as the auditor notes in their report, 77 pages of the 293-page IDFIT report on Rodriguez's previous police contacts. I don't know how to describe these other than character assassination of someone who is deceased, and it seems like a rather clumsy attempt to control a narrative that angers me, and it doesn't seem necessary because I think, as everyone here agrees, the use of deadly force was reasonable under the circumstances, and so. Given what we have, the evidence that we have, and so this either clumsiness in shaping the narrative in a favorable light for EPD, or the deliberate mischaracterization of it is, as you can probably tell, it makes me angry because I don't. I mean, it's unnecessary, and I don't expect people in these positions to do this, yeah. So that's my comment on the use of force board. I probably have other comments, but I will leave it to that. The auditor's investigation, I think, is exemplary. I think that it just was such a reminder to me how incredibly fortunate we were to have Mark with us as long as we did, and there's a point where like this is crystallized on page 3 of the auditor's report, where there's a very impeccable description of what is visible on the body worn video. Mr. Rodriguez reached into the recycle bin and pulled out a small plastic bag and an empty water bottle. He did not have to stop to converse because he was not moving other than reaching into the can. The officer radioed to dispatch leader person stop. 4 seconds later, as he approached, officer said to Mr. Rodriguez in a calm voice, "Hello, how's it going?" Mr. Rodriguez immediately replied, "Fine." Officer stated, "Stopping to chat with you because you were walking in the road." A few seconds later, Rodriguez turned about 45 degrees to his left, still holding the small plastic bag and empty water bottle in the other hand, as officer asked, "Any reason you are not using the sidewalk next to you?" Rodriguez paused and mumbled something and pointed in the westerly direction away from officer. He fussed with the plastic bottle. He did not step away from the officer. Rodriguez turned back toward the officer, and officer stated, "Well, then you continue to walk in the sidewalk then you continued once the sidewalk was available walking in the road." Rodriguez, still fussing with the bag and empty bottle, mumbled something and said, "Well, if that's the case, reason you would have stopped me up there," pointing west, "no?" Officer replied, "No, I can stop you wherever I deem necessary. Do you have an ID on you?" Rodriguez did not answer and continued to fuss with the bag and bottle. He was turned at a 90-degree angle, right, which is this way, from officer. Officer stated, "Hey." Mr. Rodriguez replied, "You have a nice day." Officer again asked, "Do you have an ID on you?" Rodriguez said something very brief, followed by, "You do whatever it is," then dropped the bottle and continued to fidget with the bag and the bottle. As he continued to fidget with the bag and the bottle. So it's 41 seconds from the time the officer first said hello. And so it goes on. But this differs so significantly from the way that it is described by the chief in the chief's memo. Rodriguez was evasive in his mannerisms in that he did not directly look at officer and seemed almost seemed indifferent to officer's presence. Every board member noted that Rodriguez intentionally turned his back to officer and moved his hands freely about his waist and out of sight of officer. Rodriguez was carrying a plastic bag and simulating he was looking for cans in the recycling bins. Board members noted that the bag was empty, etc. So there's this characterization of what Rodriguez is doing with his hands in particular, which are occupied the entire time with stuff in them, that he's fidgeting about his waist and hiding his hands and turning his back. And what's beautiful about this very, very detailed description from the auditor is that that's simply not the case. That is not what we saw in the video. And so thank you for that. And I think it's unfortunate that the investigators were not as committed to diligence and good investigative work as the auditor was.
So what struck me in this is the idea that we have an internal affairs department that does some really spectacular investigations. And what was sorely lacking in this case that we're looking at was a good investigation. That while I realize that IDFIT, the idea of it is set up by Senate Bill 111, and I think there's a lot of history when you've got a state the size of Oregon as to why the legislature chose to do this IDFIT model that needs to be approved by the Attorney General's office before being put in place. I know, and perhaps Sergeant Barrett, I can't remember if he was here before IDFIT was in place. I know Captain Adams was not here before IDFIT was put in place, but we had an interagency team that would go out and investigate these things. It was a choice by agencies within Lane County to have a major crimes investigation with multiple agencies, because if a police shooting happened in Junction City, they knew they couldn't investigate it themselves. They're a small agency, they needed help. And so the sheriff's office, EPD, Springfield, state police, maybe even Cottage Grove, they would send officers to assist in that. And the people that were on those teams were pretty spectacular. I think if you talk to somebody who was, on any of those teams or was involved in any of those investigations, they would let you know that they were some pretty stellar investigations. So I think when IDFIT came into Lane County, I think most people thought it's going to be just kind of, business as usual. We're going to continue to have, really good investigations. Is this one, the ordinary, the norm, or is this one out of the norm? Hard to say. I mean, I think the questions that were brought up, the passages that were read by Jose, point out that it's like, we would hope an investigator would not ask a question that they didn't understand why they were asking it. It shows me that perhaps the investigator hadn't reviewed the questions that were going to be put to the officer at the time. And then the fact that the question was asked kind of basically of the officer, tell us in narrative form what happened. And there were lots of things in that narrative that were never followed up on, like how hands got put on Mr. Rodriguez. It's like you kind of had to look through it. It wasn't until you watched the video that you saw how the hands were placed on him. Certainly not in an aggressive manner in the beginning, but still, it was like it just wasn't even followed up in the investigation. And then there was, in the beginning, Leah, as you were talking about the process, it was something was in the process that IA could then do an investigation. But it doesn't seem that IA did any investigation here. And so the question kind of became, well, why didn't IA do any investigation? Did the Eugene Police Department think that this investigation was so well done that there wasn't anything to follow up? Are there some union protocols in place that we're not aware of that keep anybody from being able to ask questions again? I realize that there's an ongoing lawsuit. I'm sure that comes into play as to who can be asked questions at what time and what place. So as far as the investigation goes, it's really hard when we as a group have been used to investigations that always answer our questions. And to have a case of this magnitude and not have the ability to really, say that the investigation was full and complete, and we're really able to talk about things that matter is kind of hard. That we're stuck in a place where we're not really able to do our jobs as a review board because the investigation, wasn't done to the level that we would want it to be done. Now, part of that is, if there's, the IDFIT, there's an ongoing legal legal case, does that mean that IA can't open a case? The chief seemed to say that the auditor should have brought forward, any constitutional issues, for instance, or any policy violations, that they should have been the one to bring it forth. And I guess I don't understand why police officers that go through training with regards to constitutional issues aren't able to actually look at that and say, were there constitutional rights violations here? I'm not saying that there were, but I think it's one of those things that it's like, we would normally be looking at this and saying, why wasn't this allegation brought forth? And then the auditor would say, well, here's why it wasn't brought forth. And it seems that in this case, it wasn't brought forth because of the timeline, the length of time from the initial in the November event until IDFIT completed and the auditor got everything. And by that time, the auditor isn't able to, based on the ordinance, to actually make an allegation of misconduct. But that, maybe I'm wrong, doesn't foreclose the police department, anybody on the chain of command, from the chief down to any of the officers that were there that day, to be able to say, sure seems like maybe there was a violation of constitutional rights here. And then it gets looked at. And so I guess my question is, my thoughts here are, it just seems that there needed to be more investigation, and that the auditor's office was stuck not being able to do more investigation because of the lengthy timeline of this investigation by IDFIT. Thanks.
All right. I have some comments. Hold on, my view is weird right now. I was just looking at Bernadette and she was just looking back at me and was stressing me out. Okay, so I think I really agree that I understand that IDFIT isn't in the hands of Eugene government in any sense of the word. But I really think it's a disservice to Eugene Police Department. I think Eugene Police Department is well-trained in investigating and handling this sort of thing with the help of the IA, internal, what is that? Internal, what does that stand for?
Internal affairs,
Internal affairs.
independent auditor, internal affairs. There's two.
I don't like how you do that. But I think that Eugene is well placed to help other communities, but then when the other communities have to come in and they're not as well trained as EPD, it is a huge disservice. And I think that we've really said that. A lot of people have said that tonight, so I don't need to harp on it. I was really disappointed with the interview with Officer A. I thought that was really disappointing. I was disappointed that there wasn't an audio recording. I don't know if that's just IDFIT policy to not record interviews, but I think this day and age, there's no reason not to have it recorded, just because I think when you hear people talking or see them talking, I mean, the body cams have made such a difference in investigations and being able to see what's going on because you see it. And I also think that hearing what's going on, even hearing tone of voice, hearing expressions, I think that's really valuable. And I would have liked to hear the tone and the part that Jose brought up, who's asking or who came up with these questions, it felt disrespectful to the community to me in a lot of ways, partly because it felt like he was like, or the interviewer was saying like, hey buddy, I'm on your side, who's making these questions? And it creates a different atmosphere when you're being interviewed and you kind of have that like camaraderie going on. And not to say that that's not helpful in some interviews, but I don't know, it didn't sit right with me. And I also, as Michael was saying, the shaping of the narrative about the victim, the fact that they were calling Rodriguez the suspect over and over again, that also didn't sit right when, to me, at this point, it's a victim. I understand that suspect in terms of Officer A encountering the person, Rodriguez, you can say that. Try not to use genders and then go too far. At that point, I understand that it was a suspect. Although on the other hand, it wasn't a stop. It was what did they call it? Not a stop, but I don't know. They weren't stopping them to, Michael, are you saying it?
Was it encounter?
An encounter.
Encounter.
Yeah, thank you.
Mirror
Yeah.
encounter.
Thank you, Captain too. It's an encounter. So is that even a suspect then? And then it very quickly went from suspect to victim in my view. Also, the idea of looking at Rodriguez's criminal background and police encounters, it goes against, I feel like we get this a lot where people and EPD say like, we get to be armchair quarterbacks. We get to come in and be like, well, they did it wrong, when we can say that at our board meeting. And it kind of feels the same, but on the other end, if you're saying all these things about this person that Officer A had no knowledge of at the encounter, how does that help justify the fact that the Officer A used deadly force? So that was that thing. I was really, really disappointed in the length of time that this took. I know the last time we did a officer involved shooting IDFIT case, it was about a 5 to 6 month turnaround between the event and when we had the discussion. I don't know why this one failed so horribly. I don't know if it's in IDFIT's hands. It seems like the IDFIT thing was relatively quick. It was 5 months about, which is shorter, or which is longer than it was with the last one we had. And then I'm not sure where that fell down, but it seems like kind of all cogs in the machine failed in a lot of ways. I feel like Mark could have gotten it more quickly. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know what was causing it, but there were some huge failures. And I think to the chief's comments about Mark in the chief's adjudication, the length of time does impact this. And the fact that we're talking about it right now and the public has been asking for it. I know that board members have been asking for this conversation for months and months and months. It makes it less impactful when we get to it almost to, well, a year and a half after the shooting. I think that's it for my investigative comments.
Am I next, Carolyn? Okay. So I've been taking notes. This is not well organized, but I'm just going to try to make sure that I say all the things. So first of all, I agree with what Bill and Carolyn have said about the IDFIT interview. According to the transcript, since the recording wasn't made, all I have to go off is the transcript. I thought it was very discouraging and it didn't instill me with confidence. And I'm horribly disappointed in that part of the process. I also really agree with what Carolyn just said, which was at the point that the officer made contact with Mr. Rodriguez, the officer described clearly in multiple ways in different places that they had no previous contact with Mr. Rodriguez in the past, didn't know who they were. Like so none of that information was pertinent insofar as it's not something that the officer was relying on in the decision-making process. And I didn't understand why it had to hold such an inordinate place. I think, Michael, you read the pages that were from Mark's memo, and I had kind of counted them, like 70 out of 284 pages were dedicated to previous police contacts of Mr. Rodriguez, and that there was nothing similar, I'll just note, about the officer. There were no details about the length, I mean, other than like, when was the officer hired? It wasn't clear to me, has this officer ever, had any investigations, complaints, anything else? There was nothing else about the officer that sort of balanced like that kind of like historical look at Mr. Rodriguez's criminal history. It just felt very lopsided, and I didn't like that. I agree with Michael that how incidents are characterized is really critical. And I also appreciated reading through Mark's memo where he sort of essentially like recharacterized the incident. It's also helpful because I think the public is allowed to see that characterization. And so other than us here who have watched the video, and then we can characterize for you like what we saw in the video, Mark's document does a good job of doing that, and pointed out some really, critical details. So for example, the officer never actually saying, give me your ID, as opposed to just asking, do you have an ID? Like that a lawful order maybe was never made. Like that was an important detail that was in Mark's memo. The importance of how quickly the incident unfolded. So 31 seconds into the officer's body-worn recording, the officer exited their vehicle. A minute and 23 seconds into the video was when the officer first grabbed Mr. Rodriguez's arm. And so it was very fast, like how quickly it went from, hey, why weren't you walking on the sidewalk, to the physical contact. So while that was like a low level of force, grabbing someone's arm is a relatively low level of force, it escalated quickly. And so to me, when I watched the video, I fundamentally disagreed with the characterization from the deadly force review that said the officer was, quote, slow to escalate force. And I thought that was just wrong. I fundamentally disagree that it was slow. There was nothing about playing for time in there. So it wasn't a high level of force. I will agree with that initial moment of contact, but it was not slow. So I'm going to continue on down my list here. The use of force review board. So that's another process that it seemed like it could be helpful to have an actual recording of the conversations that happen, or something more transparent than what was there. I absolutely agree with what Bill said, that the auditor should be able to vote in those. So I don't know how we move that forward, but I would like to sort of formally do that in whatever way might make sense. I heartily agree. I also was left feeling like maybe there should be part of the auditor's process where the auditor writes a formal memo, public memo, with summary of their perspective from that deadly force meeting. I was just left with so many questions. It was unclear to me what, if anything, Mark, you said in that meeting, and there were any number of things that weren't talked about in that meeting that are important. And so at some point, I'm left with a whole bunch of questions. Like, I don't understand why it doesn't appear that this was, okay, so I understand why IDFIT looks at the deadly force, and at the moment when the deadly force was used, was it legal for the officer to use that force? I understand that that's out of our purview. In this particular case, the thing that troubled me was all the things leading up to that moment. And those things are not violations of state law, but they are violations of EPD policy, the foot pursuit policy, the de-escalation policy. Those are the two big things for me that don't look like they were ever carefully looked at. And from what I can see, it doesn't look like we went through the typical process that we would in any other case where Mark opens an inquiry, there's an investigation done. Did the officer violate the foot pursuit policy? Did the officer violate the de-escalation policy? I don't understand why that didn't happen, because that's separate from IDFIT. And so that's sort of big question number one that I eventually would like someone to answer. It seems like this case was handled differently than past officer involved shootings. And so can you clarify why? Because even the memo that Mark sent out, it wasn't in the typical format. It doesn't look like there was like a formal, like, this is the auditor's adjudication, this is the chief's adjudication, this is how that whole process doesn't look like it has happened in the past. And I don't understand what happened there. It doesn't look like the process that was supposed to happen actually did. So I guess the other questions that I have jotted down here, like, was this ever entered as an inquiry? Why wasn't it ever the non-lethal force related things? Why weren't foot pursuit policy and de-escalation investigated by IA as would be typical? And let me see. The use of force board also, like when they did meet, didn't appear to consider violation of the foot pursuit policy and sort of summarily dismissed even robust it doesn't look like they seriously considered the de-escalation policy had been violated. It's unclear to me, Mark, if you can please characterize what your participation in that conversation was. Did you comment at that time about it? It's unclear if you dissented, if you made any comments at that point. I'm just totally lost as to why that wasn't addressed. And yeah, so because there wasn't a follow-up investigation on foot pursuit or de-escalation outside of the, looking at the deadly force, I don't know. I don't understand why. So I could use some help on that.
All right, that was everybody for the investigation. And I think, Lindsay, you had some direct questions for Mark, and I think this would be a good time for Mark to be able to respond to the first part of this.
Yeah, I'll try. First of all, I've never seen such a more poorly conducted interview in an officer involved shooting as I saw on this one. I don't even know what to say on that. And it's an issue. It's been an issue since I came here in 2009 in the first shooting case that I did. And I think the previous district attorney was more flexible in terms of trying to understand where some of our issues were. And even when Assistant Chief Doer was here, we tried to make some progress in terms of the process. There was an EPD detective in this interview. And I can't remember if I had the conversation with him or not, but I did have a conversation with an EPD detective in which I talked about all the flaws that occurred in every shooting investigation since I got here in 2009. And give or take, that's been about 12. And he was actually a very good listener and I think a good student. And now he's back as a patrol sergeant. And he probably has more knowledge now than anyone. As I said in the chat, they can be structured different ways, but it's still police investigating police. My understanding, and I don't have any proof, Lindsay, my understanding of why it's not recorded is many years ago, earlier than 2009, there was an officer involved shooting in a county north of here, several counties north of here. And that was recorded. And I think it might have even, I can't remember if it was filmed or not. And the officer who was involved got very emotional. And they just continued to roll the tape as he became very emotional. And the press got a hold of that and put it out into the public. And it would obviously be humiliating to that officer. So the legend is that that's why they don't record these anymore. But clearly you had a transcriber that had no clue of the jargon that's involved or what they were talking about. People talking over each other, an extraordinarily inexperienced investigator. And so, you know, that's kind of what we had to work with. I think the second issue and how I ended up where I ended up is there were so many elements to this case. There were so many bad decisions made by both people, honestly. One of the things, and I'm not here to get the officer's job or anything else. I think the officer did, what he did was through the lens of the training that he received. And even from a wisdom standpoint, you lose the first fight. And so you're going to re-engage in a second fight and you lose the second fight. And then you decide that you're going to re-engage in a third fight. Now you're 0 for 2 already in fights over a pedestrian violation. And now you're going to re-engage a third time, hoping that maybe backup will show up and we end up with a dead person over a pedestrian violation. And that's the narrative of the country right now, is this over policing of petty issues. This is just that perfect example of how a culture is so embedded into how you're going to do things, because it's through the lens of the trainers, and we know who the trainers are. And it's also just like, you know, this is just the way we're supposed to do things, and that wisdom piece is just not under consideration, I think, in the training portion. You know, it wasn't worth it for anybody. And I'm going to go on a little bit longer because this is my last time to ever go on about this stuff. No one looks at Mr. Rodriguez's perspective. His wife is the next street over. It's 24 degrees. He's probably got the car keys. He just had that encounter with the U of O Police Department. He knows his rights better than the officer knows his rights. And I think because of that encounter. And then we further are so embedded in this culture, as we said, 70 some pages devoted to character assassination, as Michael said, none of which was relevant to the officer at the time of the shooting. But I don't understand why an officer would put themselves in this situation. Again, you're already 0 for 2. In terms of then the investigative process, this kind of as this rolled through, it's taking longer with the current chief to convene use of force boards for a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons, of course, was the demonstrations, protests, and riots that happened in early summer. And so there was a lot of attention to those things and what as well. And just the fact of the matter is there weren't enough bodies to go around. But and it happened several times under the previous chief, where the chief opened an investigation for it to be implied that only Mark and Leah would have an understanding of the flaws in the initial contact, while there's 300 members of the Eugene Police Force and 15 to 20 command officers who aren't grasping any of these concepts at any point in time until I brought it up in my memo. I think there's a greater problem than the fact that it took so long for it to be brought up in a memo. And it's that, where are you? You know, where is the leadership here in terms of recognizing that this initial contact was flawed from the beginning, and how do you go about dealing with that? That's the far bigger problem in my view. In terms of the use of force board, we're looking at and I think the captain was fairly new. There's the training sergeant who's already, these are the lens that he put it into the eyes of the officers as to how to approach the situation. So you know what the response is going to be. You have another training officer or use of force expert within their department. You have the person's immediate supervisor. 2 weeks after this happened, we had a meeting with mostly the Human Rights Commission in which the chief vigorously defended the actions of the officers. So the nest I went into that use of force board, and again, I'm not a voting member, so I'm just a backbencher. I brought up the issue of de-escalation and got no traction whatsoever on it. And some of the other issues, yeah, we started to look at, because that case came out of Corvallis. So the woman who was riding her bicycle, and because she didn't give an ID, she ended up going to jail for interfering with a police officer. All those things were starting to roll through. I could have been as vigorous as I wanted to be in that meeting, and I wasn't going to get any traction whatsoever. And I think that a lot of people understand, whether I'm dealing with that or the ad hoc committee, is like, you have to know where you can gain some traction in your argument, and we've never really got it. The only time, honestly, where we really delved down with any of these issues is now a retired lieutenant. And she was probably the only one that was really vigorous. I think the perception is that it's a use of force board, so that's all we're going to look at. And I think that that's played out in nearly every situation. But yes, by the time that I started writing this case in early August, and again, doing all that research and all those things and re-listening to all that stuff takes a considerable amount of time. There are no constraints on the chief to open an internal investigation anytime he wants. There's constraints on our office, and it's in the ordinance and it's in the protocol. There are no constraints on the chief. Again, there were cases that were open that were 2 years old with the previous chief, and I won't give you examples because I can't look at them right off the top of my head. So yeah, could I have been more vigorous? He probably would have gained any traction whatsoever? No. So I don't think that that was the time or place to try to do that. In terms of IA doing the case and re-interviewing the officer, it would have been several months later. I personally, my opinion is it would be so scripted by then. And that, just like almost like I have some objections to officers watching their video before they give their interviews. Where I used to come from, the officers were interviewed right away. We wanted them to be close to the same sort of mindfulness that they were at the time of the encounter, not when it's been completely washed into a different type of narrative. And we recognize that they're not going to remember things. I remember people say, I fired 3 shots, and it turns out they fired like 12. That's okay, because we know that their adrenaline is at a very high level, and we know that they're going to forget things. But by the time they come back 3 or 4 days later, and they've seen the video, and they've had discussions with their lawyers, and they've had discussions with the colleagues, it's a different kind of interview. And I know that that's codified in state statute, and that's not going to change. And I know there's that woman who used to teach down at UCLA who says that's the best way to go about it. And I just disagree, because I've probably done close to 100 of these cases now. But it was, this case just, to me, just spoke so much again of how embedded the culture is in terms of how people are treated, how the narrative spins out, and how it's twisted in a manner that never makes the person who's not the police officer look good, even though, again, none of the facts were known to the officer at the time. And quite honestly, and I think at one point someone mentioned this was a conversation, Mr. Rodriguez never got one lawful order before hands were placed on him, not one. And again, I also recognize Oregon law is contradictory in this sense, where it's like, okay, you can't arrest someone for a violation, physically arrest, but you can detain them for a period of time to try to figure out who they are. Well, if they don't give you their ID, how are you going to figure it out? I don't know how many police officers are mind readers. I don't think there's that many. So that makes it confusing as well for his officers. You can do this and you can do that. I had command people equivocating this to a traffic stop. And we all know that driving a vehicle is a privilege. It's not a right, but walking about you have a right to do that. And the law is stated that as a pedestrian violation, it's not an arrestable offense. So I can appreciate that. But I think this entire thing is just, this officer just saw all this through the lens of the training that they received, and they both made mistakes. But I wish we would spend a little bit more time training wisdom, and is it really worth risking your life over? Because again, if I put myself in Mr. Rodriguez's shoes, and my wife is on the next street over and it's 24 degrees and I got the car keys and we're homeless, and suddenly she comes back over to the next street and I'm gone, and I have, that my husband is gone. It's not with, and pure speculation that he's also thinking about, I have to also protect my wife. Now, again, they never had this conversation, because within 1 minute or so, the fight was on. And it's just really regrettable. And I've seen it happen again. and then they just really need to fix it. But I don't think they will. And I also, because eventually I think family or whomever, we wrote a 29-page memo. A lot of it had to do with policies and things like that. But this is, I felt the strongest. It's so regrettable that the family doesn't get to see the use of force board memo and doesn't get to see our memo to learn what happened. This public records law that's trying to be passed through the legislature. This is not for, even though the advocates for it are plaintiff attorneys and the press, the advocates ought to be for the families to understand what happened in a police encounter. And in Oregon, they don't get to do that right now. And they only get to see it through your lenses. And I think that that's just really, the final straw on this whole thing is that they don't ever get to see it unless they go through a whole litigation process, which, I expect to happen. So I appreciate everyone's insight. But make no mistake about it, two things. One, I could have been more vigorous. Again, would I have gotten any traction? I doubt it. You can't tell me that not one person in that 300-person organization would have had questions about the initial stop in the first place, and no one did. And it was only, me and with the help of Leah that extracts this from this entire event, because this was a violation of this man's constitutional rights. And we're the only two that are going to extract this from this entire case, and that's troubling for me. And and finally, that the family is not going to get all the answers that I think that they deserve. Sorry for the speech. I don't get to give any of them, and I'm not going to be giving any more.
All right.
So,
Thanks, Mark. Okay. Bernadette, do you have something to say? Or Lindsay?
Yeah, I was just going to say real briefly, people have talked about how poor the interview is. And I think the one thing is, I don't think EPD gets off the hook because somebody from another agency was the interviewer for IDFIT. I mean, they're part of the process. They're part of the review board. And so if the review board doesn't think the proper questions are asked to be able to make a decision, then they need to step up and say, we have some more questions. I think certainly if another agency were to question them, their ability to do an interview, it would have to be met with, okay, let's open it back up. So I think that, as people have talked about the interview not being any good, and that we're so used to good stuff, I think there is a responsibility for EPD to say, we as an agency want this done better, and we don't feel like it was done well enough.
and I'll add to that, Bernadette, several shootings ago, I can't remember because it was just another lousy investigation. I recommended that there ought to be a lieutenant who is EPD's person in this process so that they can bring the authority with them to get this thoroughness done. And instead, we have a detective and there's a sergeant from Highway Patrol that's in charge, if you will. So there's that paramilitary sort of ranking thing. And I just think that to get the kind of investigations we deserve, the person that ought to be injected from EPD at the lowest level, at least, should be a lieutenant. And again, that idea, I got no traction. And I'm not going to blame Chief Skinner or Chief Kearns because I don't remember which case that I made that suggestion of. But we need someone with authority in that group.
Okay, I saw Lindsay's hand and then Rick's hand.
Let me lower my hand while I remember. There we go. So my question is this. So Mr. Rodriguez was killed at the end of November 2019. My understanding is that in that type of a case, the auditor's office has until the end of May, so 6 months later, to open an investigation or to look at it I can't remember like what the process is called, whether it's opening an inquiry or to do something to start looking at it. There's a timeline within which that needs to be started. And my understanding is that's 6 months in a case of something serious, like someone dying. Is that accurate? I guess that's question number one. Is my timeline correct? That if Mr. Rodriguez was killed November 2019, it would have been the end of May 2020 that the auditor's office would have had to open an investigation. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay. So from what I can see timeline wise, it looks like the DA issued their finding that the use of force was not unlawful, December 13th. That's fine. And the IDFIT process from my perspective was really just looking at that one issue. And as I said, my concerns were the violations of EPD policy, which of course IDFIT is not ever going to be an effective way to investigate because they're simply looking at different things in this case. Even though they all happened during one incident, their concerns are different. So it looks like December 13th, the DA issued her finding. March 5th was when the use of force board was convened. I'm confused about why the auditor's office didn't open any kind of inquiry or investigation before the end of May, because at this point it's beyond the possibility of opening and doing an investigation because of the timing issue. So can you help me understand that a little bit better, Mark?
Well, there's always been somewhat of a different structure on a use of deadly force than the use of force board and things like that. My recollection is, and I remember, and I don't have access to the information anymore. I wanted to make sure that I saved it. Is I don't recollect getting that decision until, you know, the report back from the use of force board until after that. And I remember, again, I think we saved that in terms of it. And in terms of conceptualizing the foot pursuit thing and all that stuff, I think until we had everything, that's not necessarily a path we were going down. And then the other thing we had too was, again, it was Memorial Weekend when all the troubles had started, and suddenly we're looking at hundreds and hundreds of hours of film and body cam and things like that. So we got certainly thrown off course. Yeah, in retrospect, could we have brought up those policy violations? Yeah, we could have. But it doesn't preclude that still happens. You know, it could happen today from internally, but yeah, in retrospect, you know, that's something I think that we could have looked at. And again, you know, there was just the focus too on the deadly force portion of it. But I don't, and we weren't thinking timelines, honestly. Even if I didn't get it until after May, we weren't looking at timelines. I knew that there was going to be an opportunity at some point in time to dissect this. Whether or not you bring the officer up on policy violations or not, again, I think is the lesser issue than just the lack of recognition of the problems that had occurred in this stop, and an almost immediate endorsement of all the officers' actions, both by the chief at that meeting and by the use of force board. I think that was the greater issue. But yeah, in retrospect, we could have opened it, and we did not.
All right, Rick, and then Jose.
I have a question that's kind of related to what Lindsay asked and what you just answered, and that is, if there were these violations of policy, potential violations of policy, such as the foot pursuit policy, doesn't that figure into the ultimate conclusion as to whether use of force was improper? Use of deadly force? Because didn't that lead to the use of deadly force actually engaging in the foot pursuit? Now I can see that there was a cutoff point at some point, because the individual who was involved, the victim, actually engaged and upgraded the escalation of the fight without any real reason to do so. But weren't those other violations also important along the way to consider? And secondly, the other question I have, something you mentioned near the end of your speech, which was that the individual had his constitutional rights violated, and I'd be interested in finding out what rights you're talking about.
To be free from an unlawful arrest. And the way I was trained, the way the courts look at things like that, even if the officer has committed policy violations, first of all, Mr. Rodriguez is still not by law allowed to resist arrest. And there's no doubt in my mind that this officer, again, through the lens of the training that I've seen over the years, thought that he had a legitimate arrest here. I don't think there was maliciousness in his decision to make an arrest. You still have to frame when you're in a fight for your life, which I think he was, or of serious physical harm, that he has a right to defend himself in that manner. So that's still part of the overall picture, but that's a capsule in and of itself.
Jose?
Yeah, just first to clarify, do we have 2 more rounds to talk about 2 more subjects on this? Okay, cool. My question, I think, is investigation related here. Officer A's body-worn camera ends right before the shooting occurred. Why? Or
It got knocked off in the fight, in fight number 1.
okay, yeah, excuse me, not before the shooting occurred, in the first engagement, maybe, right? Because that happened multiple times. Excuse me. So it was because it was knocked off in combat or something.
Yes.
And we've seen videos, Jose, also just for perspective, of cameras being knocked off and not turned off, like it keeps recording even though it's on the ground. And then you reminded me of another question. It sounded like, curious about why ICV wasn't enabled. And it sounds like when you activate your body worn camera, it should also activate the ICV. Is that true? Just wasn't working that night? Maybe Jason or
I was gonna say Jason or Mark.
Yeah, we did.
I think there wasn't there a technical, or Jason knows, Jason.
yeah, let's hear
Go ahead,
Jason's.
He didn't turn on his overhead lights, as I recall. That would automatically turn on the ICV. And I guess with the Axon system we have now, it doesn't automatically activate. He physically turned on his body worn, which I would have thought would have activated his ICV, but I don't think that system we have in place right now automatically does that. At least it didn't in this case.
Okay. All right, great. I think we should move on to adjudication. Oh, Michael? Okay, we're gonna move on to adjudication. I'm sure you all noticed Bill had to leave. He had another thing to attend. He wanted to come and share some thoughts, and I appreciate that he did, but he is no longer in our rotation. Anyway, we're gonna start with Rick, right? No, we're gonna start with Jose with adjudication. And I will put it back. I'll put it back in the chat.
I think that this is going to be my one chance to editorialize. I want to compare passages and maybe just kind of let them speak for themselves. So the investigations division report on page 1, 2, 3, 4, very a paragraph up from where Michael was reading last turn. As an agency, we are focused on de-escalating potential violent situations to avert any use of force to control an incident. Nothing in the board discussion indicated we should reduce any attempts at de-escalation, but rather did we have anything to learn from officers' approach to Rodriguez, and would the outcome of the encounter been different had officer approached Rodriguez as a stop? The sentence that I highlighted and that I want to compare is this one. No clear answer emerged from the discussion, as it is impossible to try to predict the outcome. On page 11 of the auditor's report, which page 11, the paragraph after the section 3, this also makes me concerned that officer does not know the law around reasonable suspicion, or that EPD does not adequately train on this area of the law. And 2 paragraphs down, I think Mark already mentioned this, 43 seconds into their interaction, officer had not given, still not given Mr. Rodriguez a lawful order. I think that if we are to, if we're after reconciliation, if we're after, you know, making and state and sustaining community in Eugene, Oregon, despite this, not because of this, then we need some kind of truth and reconciliation kind of thing. I know this is not apartheid South Africa, but when I read that sentence back there, no clear answer emerged. I want to ask how you come to that conclusion. The turning point for me is page 9 of is on page 9 of the police auditor's memorandum. Points 3 and 4. In our last meeting, we had a great presentation on wellness and what it could do for our community, right? I think if we include a commitment to the truth as a part of wellness, it could go a long way in reconciling and we're asking our community to have faith to do the impossible despite this. That's the definition of faith in a non-secular way. Then what must be reciprocated in return is a commitment to truth, a kind of coming to grips about this case could be a turning point. We could recognize it and say, we really fucked it. We really screwed up. Doing justice to Mr. Rodriguez is impossible. But as a community, we're being asked to do the impossible. So when I read that sentence, I feel authorized to be a little raw about this from Michael. So I appreciate that, Michael. That no clear answer emerged. That makes me, I have a visceral reaction to that. So I agree with the police commissioner. Fine.
Me? Since we really are left with only a decision with respect to the use of deadly force, I have to concur that the officer was within his justification for using deadly force under the circumstances. I do think that the issue regarding foot pursuit was a valid one raised by Mark, and could have led to the escalation of the situation that led to the ultimate involvement of more escalated fighting, which then in turn led to the death. On the other hand, we're not charged with doing anything about that in this setting. It seems to me that we're limited to viewing what happened in the Deadly Force Review Board. And I think that I'm stuck with saying, I think that the use of force was justified.
All right, I think I'm next. Yeah, so, first off, I want to, since I realize that the chats don't show up in the YouTube version of this, I just want to like state now, and I wish I could go back in time and put it earlier in the recording, that I was mistakenly referring to the chair of the board of the use of force board's memo as the chief's memo. Not written by the chief, it was addressed to the chief. I've made that mistake before on this committee, where like referred to one of Leia's memos as the chief's memo, because it was addressed to the chief. And I guess I'm just not a good reader of those little headings of memos. Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry, chief. I do understand the purpose of the CRB as kind of broad, and this is partly because maybe I'm not a lawyer, and so I tend to see this as an opportunity for members of the community to participate publicly in this process, and the participation of the community is limited to the 7 of us, and so I take that responsibility very seriously, and see this as an opportunity to really provide transparency to this process, and so to speak about as many things that I think come up that I see as important, and so I want to first off touch on one thing that I forgot to mention in the investigation comments. So I don't know if I'm the only one who went to Acacia, but Avenue, but I have my best friend lives on Linda Avenue, which is like 1 block across the thing, and so I went there and looked around, and there's a lot of these sidewalks. I'm a frequent walker, and there's a lot of these sidewalks in Eugene that are just treacherous at night, and Eugene has poor lighting and uneven sidewalks, especially when trash bins are out. Sometimes they're on the sidewalk, sometimes they're in the street. Acacia, there's actually an implanted multi-box mailbox units for an apartment building that's in the middle of the sidewalk, and there's someone has a basketball. I don't know if that was up a year and a half ago, but it's like a basketball hoop on the sidewalk. And just walking along in broad daylight, I stumbled. I actually stumbled. I'm also clumsy, but so if I were collecting cans from recycling bins that are going to be on both sides of the road, and there's only a sidewalk on one side, I'm probably going to walk down the middle of the road. I frequently walk down the middle of don't tell anyone, but I frequently walk down the middle of Lincoln, where I live, when I'm walking my dog at night because I don't want to trip on the sidewalks, and so that said, it was a pretext stop. I think we're all clear on that. Those are legal in Oregon. So, but I just wanted to put that out there, that I think I don't necessarily see the behavior as unreasonable. There's a point in the auditor's report related to this, where they mentioned that, I lost the page, rat. The part of the suspicion for this stop was that Rodriguez was engaged or about to engage in other criminal activity, and that, as the auditor notes, this was not supported in the interview by specific articulable facts. The officer does state in their interview that there had been past criminal activity on the street 1 block north, and the auditor's office, being excellent investigators, contacted EPD and Internal Affairs to ask them if this had been the case in the past several months. Internal Affairs could produce no records of criminal activity on that street in the previous months, which, we make mistakes. I made a big mistake just tonight. So people make mistakes, they misremember things. But in the context of an interview that someone's preparing for that is of this gravity, I'll just let it sit there. That was a false statement, whether it was intentional or not. I want to mention 3 things with regard to adjudication. The first is the de-escalation. I agree with all of the adjudications made by the auditor's office in this case. But I want to single out the de-escalation. That it seemed very clear to me when I first watched the video that what was happening was an escalation. And it occurred, I finally realized why I'm often like tripped up by the de-escalation policy when it comes up in these cases, which is that I think I understand de-escalation as doing what one can to scale down the situation. And so, if someone who is not doing anything, not threatening violence, is appearing to get agitated, I might, to de-escalate, step back, right? Create physical distance between me and them. Especially if I've already called other people, I know they're on their way. What I might, instead of raising my voice, lower my voice. But I think and I haven't said it in a training, but I'm gaining the suspicion that maybe like it's just thought about different. Like maybe that's not how, like, it has a different understanding professionally for EPD, that it's about this use of force continuum. It's about starting in a certain place. It's about using certain skills. And if those skills have been used, then de-escalation has happened. And that seems consistent with how I see it discussed in these files. And so, the opening bit of conversation does seem to be not escalating, right? It's how are you? Why are we walking the road? You have, there seems to be an attempt on the part of the officer at not escalating. But then it's almost as if once Rodriguez becomes challenging, right? Begins to challenge the authority of the officer, that the things have been escalated on the part of of Rodriguez, and so therefore it must be then escalated by the officer rather than further de-escalated, right? I just always think of parenting in this way, even though I'm not a parent, right? That doesn't work. I know that doesn't work from watching friends who are parents. And so, I think it seems clear to me that what happened here, what I saw, was a case of both gentlemen escalating the situation, and with tragic results. And I think that insofar as what we're looking at are EPD policies and the officer's relation to those, I concur with the auditor's office adjudication that the officer failed to de-escalate this situation. With regard to excessive force, I again agree, concur that I missed the number on this. This is before foot patrol. There we go. Page 17. So whether officer could go hands-on with force and arrest Mr. Rodriguez for interfering with a police officer for passive resistance to a violation, adjudication recommendation, no. Was the force used at the moment that officer went hands-on excessive? Adjudication, yes. I concur with both of those. It does seem to me that it was, given that we have a case where Mr. Rodriguez was not interfering insofar as he was engaged in passive resistance. He was calmly and rationally stating his rights and asking for a sergeant. Yeah, I think that doesn't seem to be an appropriate use of force at that point. Obviously, as things escalate and the officer pursues on by foot twice, and then they're in a confrontation where there's a taser used by both people. At that point, then that's a different moment, a different question. That question's been addressed by IDFIT and by the use of force board as well, and by the auditor who finds that the use of deadly force in that at that moment was justified. And then the third point that I want to single out my concurrence is with the foot patrol, which has been talked about, and so I won't belabor that one.
As Michael was talking, it reminded me that wasn't there a previous case where it was a similar situation, not officer involved shooting, but where somebody asked for a sergeant, and it just kind of made me think it was like, why are they asking for sergeants, and whether or not that at any point in time in training with the officers, whether that might be something that should like kind of trigger something in the officers to slow down and take that step back to make the distance, to kind of reevaluate that if somebody's asking for a supervisor, maybe that's the attempt to de-escalate, to slow things down that we've talked about in the past. I'm not going to go into a lot here because I think I agree with Rick that we're really only looking at the use of force in this one, because unfortunately EPD didn't choose to bring up other allegations and look into the foot pursuit, the constitutional rights, and they didn't. I mean, we know that they can internally generate things. We know that Blue Team lots of times brings cases to the auditor's office to review. So to say that the auditor didn't bring it forward, I think is a bit of a cop out to say that. I think something that would be interesting to see, and I don't know that it's possible, is the statistics on how many times are these things done, these contacts made that are completely successful in the sense that nobody is injured at the end of it. And I think kind of taking that into perspective when we start talking about policy changes, it's like, it's not to say that we shouldn't look at other things, but we don't want to make wholesale changes because of this if it works, hundreds or upon thousands of times, or does it only work, tens of 20s of times. But I think it's one of those that we need to be aware of. And if there is something to change, it is the only thing that's different in this one than everything else is the person who was contacted, or is there something else that needs to be looked at? And part of that goes back to the training. Who are the trainers? What are the trainers telling them? And I think the trainers also need to remember that they are people training because they have a lot of years of experience. And so there are things that they just take for granted in the training process that somebody with 2 years, 5 years doesn't have, that they have after 15 or 20. And I think that's a part of the training that needs to be reminded on a pretty regular basis. And while people go on ride-alongs with officers. I wonder, do officers go on ride-alongs with mental health workers? Do they go and see, people that have mental health or outside of their job? Because when you're in the uniform and you're contacting somebody with mental health issues, it's completely different than, if you're doing a ride along with cahoots, you're not in uniform and you're seeing somebody who is agitated and then watching how they actually, can bring somebody back to being okay. Somebody told me the story about, I'll be quick, an officer trying to get somebody in the back of the car who really didn't like officers. And they said, hey, how about if we stop at McDonald's and I'll give you a ride? And so the guy said, oh, we'll go to McDonald's. And the guy hopped in the car. They drove through the drive-through, got him McDonald's, and took him to the Johnson unit or the jail. I can't remember which one it was. But, it's just one of those ideas that it's like sometimes you've got years of experience and you can think outside the box. But getting back to the adjudication, I agree with Rick that the really only thing we're looking at is the use of force. I agree that it was justified or it was lawful. And I wish that there had been an IA investigation into some other things to be able to fully look at and discuss those.
That's an interesting thought, because my first initial, well, let me first, before I start talking, Jose, to the panelists, said that he misspoke and that he wanted to amend the record that he concurs with the police auditor's finding. I think he said the police commissioner, but he meant the police auditor. So I want that in the record for the minutes and also for the YouTube rebroadcast later on. And okay, so then for my own thing, I think that this is also just a bad thing with the investigation, that that Rick and Bernadette are saying that we shouldn't look at anything but the use of force, because I think that there's a bit of a disservice to the whole thing that it wasn't looked at, because the de-escalation could have changed this totally. And I think if we start looking at things saying like, at the point where use of force was used, sure, it was justified. But if we're starting to like brush everything else under the rug, I'm making just blanket statements here, then that can be harmful to public trust of police officers. I think that in this case, I agree with the auditor that everything at the point of when the force happened, yes, it was justified. It was within policy. And also I want to definitely put it on the record that I think that I agree with the auditor when they said that de-escalation was not within policy. There was no reason to engage with this level of an uncooperative encounter, that it should have within 4 minutes become 3 gunshots. So, Lindsay.
Yeah, just, and maybe I'm not understanding, but like my understanding of why we can, like Rick and Bernadette, that you're saying that we can really only look at the deadly forces because there wasn't an actual investigation, a full investigation done about the policy violations. And as far as that's concerned, I agree. It doesn't appear that that happened. I don't disagree with the characterization that anybody at EPD could have opened up looking at those policy violations, but looking at the Deadly Force Review Board, from what I can see of it, since it's not recorded, and I can, look at the reports and I can, look at the PowerPoint slides and see what was discussed in summary, there was nobody at EPD who had any interest in further pursuing looking at de-escalation. So at that point, I think it's incumbent upon the auditor to open it up. There was nobody else who was interested in looking at de-escalation, and nobody else even brought up foot pursuit or any of these other potential policy violations in the Deadly Force Review Board. So there was no evidence that that was going to happen. So I'm still angry. Angry is the only way I can say it. I am angry that this was not fully investigated for the policy violations, because at this point, because of the way that the ordinance is written 6 months beyond the date, if it hasn't been opened, that it can't be opened. So at this point, there's nothing that I can do other than be angry that this was not properly investigated according to my standard. the policy violations of de-escalation and foot pursuit weren't looked at. And I have no idea what would have happened had the policies been more closely followed. No one has any way of knowing that, but there was so much room. There was so much room for something else. And so this officer will never have any formal anything based on the foot pursuit or the de-escalation policy, because an investigation was never opened and it was never, so I'm horribly dissatisfied with that. And there's nothing I can really do about it other than to say that I suppose for the future, and this is, maybe something, a different section or whatever. I mean, I agree with the auditor's adjudications, but it's adjudications to nothing. It's not actionable. So I'm left sort of just dissatisfied. That's all. So, I mean, in terms of other things, I suppose like, longer timelines would potentially be helpful, or those types of things, which I've mentioned in other meetings, and which hopefully council will be considering, as the ad hoc committee has also made such recommendations. But for now, yeah, there's nothing I can really do about the things that I'm dissatisfied about. They're not remediable, and that's really disappointing.
Lindsay, that's a really good segue into our next section of policy recommendations. And I would like to ask, if possible, I want everyone to be heard and I want your voices to be heard, but I also want to be cognizant of time, and we're already 7 minutes over and we still have over a half hour of stuff to do. Leah?
I wanted to offer something really quick before policy. So, but when you're done with your spiel, but.
Okay. So if people can be concise as we share our policy recommendations, that would be great. Because I do want to hear auditor report and closing comments. So that's my spiel. Leah.
All right, I just wanted to mention, I'm very interested to hear the policy recommendations. I really want to hear where you all are thinking. I also want to stress that just the concerns that you all have brought up are I appreciate this group's thoughtfulness on all of this. And also I've definitely had a lot of discussions with internal affairs and command staff at EPD about how we ensure that that we don't have a product like this in the future, basically. And we can't fix IFIT from an internal point of view, but we can work really hard to change our practices around the use of force board and around the administrative investigation that happens after a deadly force incident, to ensure that it's a thorough investigation, that the force board gets to look at all of the things. So I guess what I'm trying to assure you is that just because the policies themselves perhaps have not, I don't know that they've changed since this, our practices already have. And one of those, I appreciate that Captain Adams is here, because one of those changes is that he's chairing all of the use of force board. So him getting this feedback, I think, is really important for when we have those in the future. So I will not take up your time, but that's just, I wanted to stress that.
Thank you, Leah. That is good to know. We talk about this a lot, that best practice can still be used even when it isn't the policy. I think we all do that in our jobs, and it's good that EPD can also do that. Rick, could you please start us off with policy recommendations?
I don't have any major policy recommendations. I think that my problem with this has been what we're stuck with IDFIT. And I think that's a huge issue. And I don't see any change in that with the new legislative suggestions that are up in the Salem right now, nor do I see any change immediate. So I think that that's something that the city council could maybe wrap into their thoughts about, putting into place the recommendations of the ad hoc committee also.
Sorry, I totally lost track of those. I was up next. So recommendations. I have, so there were three things. One, I wanted to bring up which it sounds like maybe already is being talked about. I noticed in the somewhere early in the file, it was mentioned that the in-car video wasn't activated because the lights weren't started, and so I was hoping to see that recommendation show up at the end of the use of force board memo in their list of recommendations, but it wasn't. So I actually wrote in number 6, dash cam. I think that it sounds like there was an earlier system where it was continuously running, and then the newer system, it's not. I don't know why that, I don't know why any company changes its systems. It's usually a long, complicated process that involves many people making discussions along the way. So I don't want to armchair quarterback that, except to say that it would have been nice in this case if it had still been running, if we'd still been on the old system, although maybe the old system was inferior for all kinds of other reasons. One other thing I wanted to mention was that we did not get the memo that is mentioned by the auditor's office. There was a separate memo with recommendations about the IDFIT process. Is that correct? There was a separate memo that's mentioned that we did not get. I'm looking at Leah Mark.
Mark, you're muted.
Yeah.
There you go.
I think in this case, I don't think I ended up writing one for my departure.
All right. Fair
But
enough.
I'm sure that there are, and I'm sure Leah could find them on about every shooting case. There are ones, and you're certainly entitled to those. So they are in the archives, but yeah, it was.
Gotcha.
I probably didn't get to writing that.
Sounds like maybe that's boilerplate because they're always recommending the same recommendations you have for changing it.
I said from the first shooting that I got here, and I had experience doing a lot of them, was like, just let me run these things, and and people will get all the answers that they deserve, and everyone will be treated fairly. That falls on deaf ears, and it's not the way it's written in the law.
The only other thing that I had was, again, I wanted to circle back to my opening comments about for lack of a better word, first aid efforts from EPD on the scene, and just to commend the difficulty of that. And given our discussion last month about officer wellness, I know that tends to focus on the officer involved in the shooting, but I feel like I vicariously experienced that process of attempting to keep someone alive and having that not happen, and I really hope that the wellness program encompasses officers in those situations, because that's a horrible thing to have to go through. I can't imagine, and my heart goes out to them, as well as to obviously the family of the deceased and everyone else in this situation. And with that, I will also note that, just in case anyone was wondering, it is root beer that I've been drinking during this meeting. So for the YouTube record, it was root beer.
I, like Rick, have no policy recommendations to advise on.
I don't know that I have any specific policy recommendations that haven't already been talked about. I would like, and Michael, as our police commission liaison, I would like it if you could bring some of these ideas forward to the meeting when you attend. One thing I'd really like you to bring forward is the idea that the auditor should have a vote and more of a say in the deadly force process. I know that there's not a lot we can do about IDFIT, but I think there is a lot we can do about the next step of this investigation. And I think that can come from police commission. And I think with the ad hoc recommendations going through city council, they might have some teeth in this issue also. So That's my sort of non-recommendation recommendation.
So I agree. So I would also like it if if the auditor would have a voting role on the use of force board, and that the proceedings of those boards be more thoroughly recorded. For the sake of transparency, the CRB should be able to see more about what happens there. As I said earlier, I think it would be helpful if the auditor also wrote some kind of public memo of their characterization of the use of force board, regardless of whether they're a voting member, sort of highlighting any issues or discrepancies or points about which maybe they disagreed. I think that could be helpful for creating a record. I think all lethal uses of force should have an administrative review of EPD policy outside of the Deadly Force Review Board and outside of the IDFIT process. I think we should go ahead and do that. I think timelines for opening cases should be longer. The ad hoc committee has made such recommendations, and so I would just like to voice further support for that there should be a longer timeline to open open reviews from the auditor's office perspective. And my final one is, just because pretext stops are legal doesn't necessarily mean we have to do them. And I think I don't know enough to be, like Bernadette was sort of alluding to, like, I personally don't know enough about their usefulness, efficacy, safety. I don't know that they increase public safety and I certainly think it deserves looking at more closely, regardless of whether they're legal or not, because we can choose to not do things that are legal when they don't serve us, if they don't serve us. And I think we should start by asking the question do these pretext stops serve us as a community writ large? And my answer is I simply don't know, but I think we should ask. And I think we should we should know more, because I wonder if they serve us and if that should be part of our practice. And that's it.
I'll try to be brief and to own the things that I'm saying here. Again, I don't know where to start. Is this the example or the exception? That conversation kind of recurs every time we meet, right? Is this the example or the exception? Okay, if it was a systemic thing, if it was just the person who was contacted, then how do we rule out implicit bias from this, which is a systemic thing? I see people walking in my street in the middle of the street every day, but because I live in Cal Young, officers aren't harassing people every day. So I'm left to wonder if this is an irreconcilable thing. There's a deeper dispute here than initially appears to me. It's a dispute over what de-escalation means as a matter between things like life, living, and dying. I'm just going to belabor this report. The investigations division report at one point says the board systematically went through de-escalation policy but focused on the techniques and tactics portion when comparing the tactics employed by officer. Point 1, tactical communications include active listening. Officer used good communication skills all the way down to Rodriguez asked officer why he was being arrested, and officer responded for interfering. This stood out to the board members as it showed Rodriguez was hearing the commands provided by officer. I guess the dispute is over whether those were lawful commands or whether there was a lawful command. And again, if we go back to the auditor's report, there's a direct antagonism with that finding. one party sees this as good active communication, another party sees this as clear and opposite failure. We're not talking about a degree of difference here. We're talking about two very different things, conversations happening like this, not like this. So I'm left wondering if this is reconcilable, if we have a reliable understanding of what like community wellness means. I mean, to me, it's, I want to distill and go back to the basics on some things and be like, yeah, I think that there's a deeper dispute over surrounding things like the use of force, violence, and implicit bias.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for a very thoughtful and very thorough discussion. I appreciate it a lot. Leah, do you have a quick auditor's report?
I'll make it very quick. I'm going to start by thanking Mark for staying up past his bedtime to temp for us. No, I appreciate all of your work on this. I appreciate you showing up to talk about it. And it's nice to see you. So thank you, Mark. And I really want to thank Captain Adams for coming as well. I think it was probably a difficult thing to sit through, and I know he's taking really good notes. And I just appreciate him being here to listen and hear your feedback. And I want to, and I always appreciate your thoughtful feedback too. And in the interest of speeding up, I'll try to speed up, Carolyn, I know. So we are on the council schedule for presenting the CRB annual report and the police auditor's annual report on June 28th. I will write my annual report this week, and I have a group of you who are working on the CRB annual report and additions to it. I appreciate that. So we will get all that into council by Monday. Also on Monday, the posting closes for the associate auditors. So I'm very excited. We've had some good applications come in, and I'm really excited to get some help, and I'm excited to see how that all works out. But if you know anyone who you think would be a good candidate, please tell them to get their information in before Monday, because it closes on Monday. This is a little scattered, sorry. This is how my brain works, but along the lines of the ad hoc committee report, and a lot of what we talked about tonight is relevant to that. I don't know how many of you watched that. So what council decided to do was they appointed me and Sarah Maderi, the city manager, and Judge Greg Gill, the municipal court judge, to look at the ad hoc committee report and make recommendations to council about how do we incorporate these concerns into our local justice system. So it's a daunting piece of work, but I'm grateful that we have some time. I think we're going to be a good team, and it's the 3 employees who report directly to council. So if you're wondering why they chose us, that's why. So we've been meeting, and we are working and looking to get our first report back to council by the end of July. And I'm looking forward to using this opportunity to fold in a lot of what I heard tonight from you all, as far as, deadly force and deadly force reviews, which are obviously a huge concern. Jason, we have lots of thank yous. So Jason has left now, so he won't hear this, but he is moving to violent crimes from internal affairs. So he will no longer be our internal affairs person. It will be Sergeant Ryan Nelson will be filling that position for a while, at least. And one of the interesting things is just that Sergeant Barrett will now be one of the IDFIT call out people. So it'll be kind of, I think, nice to have that IA connection with the IDFIT response, and specifically with my showing up at crime scenes, because sometimes I'm welcome, sometimes I'm not. I don't know why. Let's see, council will also be voting on new members of this body on the 14th. So Lindsay's term has ended, and she has given us everything. And so she's not reapplying. And Rick's term has ended, and there were some technical complications. So I'm not sure what council is going to do, but I want to thank you both very much for all of your time. and all of your work, and my goodness, all of your work on the ad hoc committee, because you've had a heck of a year and you deserve breaks, both of you, regardless of whatever happens. So I'm very appreciative of all of your work. Oh, I just wanted to point out, I was thinking during the discussion really quick that since this, I mean, because we've had such a lapse of time since this incident occurred until the review, I was thinking of all the de-escalation cases that we've actually looked at in the in-between time that have occurred. And Michael was mentioning about how his perception of like why you get stuck on that policy sometimes. And I was just, I don't know, I'm gonna have to formulate my thoughts a little better, but I just think it's interesting that I think the perception of how that policy is applied and investigated and violated or not has changed a lot since this incident occurred. And I think a lot of that is because you guys are reviewing those cases and when we are giving that feedback back. And then the final thing is Beatrice and Vicky are amazing people. I love them. I'm so grateful for their support. And Beatrice and I talked, and we are thinking about trying to put together a public safety forum next spring when she's back, given that a lot of the people who come have small children. We don't know that we want to try to put it before that because small children are still unvaccinated children. So that is the plan. And please let me know if you have any input or feedback on that. And I will be working, Michael, I'll touch base with you so we might be able to figure out a way to sort of put all of this together in a nice little package for a police commission, but I really appreciate all of your work and I will stop talking now, although Mark is unmuted. So Mark might give a former auditor's report. What are you saying, Mark? Oh, Bernadette.
I was just gonna.
I think it's Michael's turn.
Say thanks again, and I miss the people very, very much. I don't miss the work. It's not easy, and just want to thank, same with Leah and Beatrice and Vicky. It was just an honor and a privilege to work with them, and almost everybody at EPD, quite honestly. As our report shows, more than 50% never ever get a complaint against them, and really do a great job in a very difficult situation every day. And I'm very appreciative of the work that the vast majority of them do. And I couldn't do it, and I know a lot of people couldn't do it. Lindsay and Rick, your work on the ad hoc committee, I think was just fantastic. And I'm just gonna, miss everybody and miss the crew, but yeah, don't miss the work. And I don't really feel retired yet because there's a lot of work to be done here. We have a hoarder in the house, so we have to work through those things. But again, it was an honor and a privilege to work with all of you and work for the city of Eugene. And we're very happy where we are now. And even though there's a whole lot of hot down here in the summertime, we're very, very happy.
All right, Michael, do you want to start us off with closing comments?
Yeah, I don't think I have any. I think I used myself up with the opening comments. So
I just wanted to point out that I know we were supposed to, Michael and Rick and I, get together and have some things that we were supposed to give to you guys tonight that we were going to add on to our auditors, our CRB report that we're hoping to submit to City Council. But I got about halfway through the 10 years of annual reports, because I think the idea of trying to summarize, the things that we've seen and the changes that were made as a result of that, to give kind of the long view, that sometimes I think maybe people in the ad hoc committee may not have realized the policies that have changed as a result of what we do. And so those incremental changes, those thoughtful changes that, you kind of try to anticipate, that so you don't have the unintended consequences of making a big change and kind of go, oh, I didn't think it was going to cause this problem. So working on that. Michael and Rick and I are getting together tomorrow with Leah to kind of hash out some points of that long view, and hopefully we will have an excellent report to present to City Council. That's all.
I think that's perfect. You guys can report that at our next meeting, and that'll be a good intro to our new members, possibly to share what you come up with. So good timing to not have it ready tonight. I want to definitely echo my thanks for Lindsay and Rick for your service. You guys have been here almost my entire time, and you will be missed. I have always appreciated both of your voices. So you'll be missed. And if Cindy or Captain Adams could please pass on my thanks to Jason too, that would be appreciated. His work has been incredible. He's done a really good job as the IA. So thank you.
I'll take care of that tomorrow. We're happy to have him VCU. It's going to be awesome.
Are you done, Carolyn? Okay. So thank you all. It's been a great experience working on this board, although difficult at times. And I appreciate you all showing up and bringing your perspectives. I've said this many times, but this is like one of those few places in civic life where I think people come together and don't always agree, but still have dialogue and discussion. I think that's really, really valuable. I think it's a good practice, and it's important, and it's something that we need more of for a healthy democracy. So thank you all for being part of that in this very small kind of way. I guess I'll just finish by saying, just like a couple, takeaways. I am very thankful that over the years, different people in Eugene have advocated and made changes to have police oversight for a variety of reasons. And it's never for good reasons, right? It's always for bad things that have happened, but there are changes that have happened, right? From the Lara and Magana days to now, things change, and things continue to change. Even from the shooting of Brian Babb until now, we have de-escalation policies. We have things that we didn't have before. And it's absolutely not worth the costs, right? The costs in life and harm that's been done. However, once those harms have happened, I'm at least somewhat thankful that those opportunities haven't been wasted, and that we continue to make change and to pursue something that looks better and better serves our community and looks more like public safety. So thanks just to all the people who've been part of that. That's a really long, it's been a long path, and I appreciate that there have been people along the way who carry that. So thank you all. I'll also say, I've said this in other meetings, but the investigations that I've seen as a part of this board have always been exceptional. They're thorough, they're well done. I've only in one case ever asked for additional information or had additional questions that weren't just openly provided to me, and then later, and due to my request, then things were subsequently given to me. And I have so much trust and faith in the quality of those things, and I wish that everybody could see them, because I think it would build a lot of trust. So that's not within our power to do here, but I'll continue to advocate that that the public should be able to see more of this, because I think it would only be helpful. So thank you all. I enjoyed spending time with you all, and I wish you all well.
Jose, I think it's your turn.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm at a guess too. So thanks. Yeah, I'm also thankful for the opportunity to disagree with people, because it's hard to come by those opportunities today. So I look forward to more disagreeing with you all.
And Rick, I think you're the last one to close us out.
I think that's a great way to end things. I think that, as Lindsay said, this board has always been a place where you could go share your ideas and not feel that you're angering anybody unnecessarily or, breaking friendships. It's a rare thing in our society today that happens, and I'm pleased to have been part of it, and I appreciate all of you. Thank you.
All right, I think with that, we can adjourn. So we will see you again, I think in July or August.
July is the plan, not August.
Okay,
Thanks, everybody.
thank you.
Thank
Hi,
you,
good
Captain Adams.
to see everybody.
Bye.
Let's see.